Cardinal News is telling the little-known stories of Virginia's role in our country's march to independence. As we head toward America's 250th anniversary, we'll examine the events, people, and places that shaped the Commonwealth and the nation. Together we can better understand the role of our ancestors beyond what's in the history books. This is Cardinal 250, made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission.
Welcome to Cardinal News 250. I'm Dutchie Jessee, and today I'm speaking with historian, author, and professor Woody Holton. Holton teaches early American history at the University of South Carolina and has written numerous books on revolutionary history. His book, Abigail Adams, won the Bancroft Prize. Other books of his have been given numerous accolades and been finalists for prizes as well. Woody, thank you so much for speaking with us and joining us for Cardinal News 250.
Thanks for the invite, Dutchie.
Yes. So first things first, your last name. For anyone who's not already familiar with you, it's Holton, and you are the son of the late Virginia Governor Linwood Holton, right?
Yes, that's where the love of history comes from.
There you go. Also, you have roots to Roanoke.
Was born there, as were both of my sisters and my brother. And we come back a lot. We've got cousins there.
And right now you're joining us from Columbia, South Carolina, right?
From my front yard. Appreciate you letting me talk to you from out here. I'm having a great day already.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Now, the Cardinal News 250 project is intended to tell the lesser-known stories of Virginia's role in the formation of our country, which fits perfectly with your body of work. You and I were talking, hey, what are the things we could talk about for this interview? And you let me know that your specialty is the people who don't appear on the back of the $2 bill, but probably should. Go on about that, if you would.
Well, I may need another way of putting it because no one has a $2 bill anymore.
Exactly.
But, your viewers will probably recall that on the back of the $2 bill is that famous John Trumbull painting of the presentation of the Declaration of Independence. And it's all white men, almost all wealthy men. And none of my work is about, they were unimportant. It's just that there's all these other people that were also important. For instance, as you know, the Roanoke Valley was about as far as you can go before you're on a river like the New River that empties ultimately into the Mississippi. And the reason that matters is that the British tried to stop westward expansion between those two valleys, the Roanoke Valley and the New River Valley, and say to their own colonists, you may not settle west of there. And the British did that not as a favor to the Indians, but out of fear of the Indians. They didn't want to go to another war against the Indians. And so one of the first things I researched was the Native American women, actually, who initiated an effort to build an alliance of, hey, we're Shawnees, you're Miami, you're Cherokee. Alone, we're not very powerful, but if we band together, we can launch a big war against the colonists. And it was exactly to prevent that war that the British government drew this line called the Proclamation Line in 1763 along the crests of the Appalachian Mountains, saying to their own colonists, you can't go west of here. And everybody remembers enough of American history to remember that westward expansion, that's one thing you'd better not get in the way of, and the British did. And so that's one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence. And what people don't always think about is, had there been no Native Americans, had they been there but just not fought for their land, then that's one grievance crossed out of the Declaration of Independence.
I am curious. You referenced, growing up in a political family, if you will, son of the governor, in your love of history. Did that start just right from an early age for you?
It did. The first chapter book I read, my father gave me, and it was a biography of Thomas Jefferson. You know how people talk to Jesus. I went through a period of saying, well, what would Jefferson do? I had my own WWJD. What would Jefferson do? Since going to college and reading more of what other people had to say about Jefferson and discovering from teachers there that he owned 600 human beings over the course of his lifetime. And actually, he was a little worse than others, I have to say, in that he knew it was wrong. You might be able to make a case for some people well, everybody's got slaves. I've got slaves. What's the big deal? But Jefferson was too smart for that, and he said that he said in many more eloquent ways than I ever could what a great evil slavery was. And so ever since college at University of Virginia, I have had a very ambivalent feeling about Jefferson, and I kind of go back and forth. Where I am now is he's still the guy who wrote all men are created equal. And so when I think about the revolution, I think about this constant tension between the amazing, splendid principles that people like Jefferson and later Madison, when he wrote the Bill of Rights, he was kind of forced to write the Bill of Rights. He didn't want a Bill of Rights, but he wrote them, and they're beautiful. And so there's this, I think, fascinating tension between the principles written down in that era and the realities of that era and every era, because those of us on earth, none of us is perfect. And so that tension between the imperfections and sometimes the evils of the founding fathers and their principles, and that tension is mediated by all the other people who should have been on the back of the $2 bill: Native Americans, African Americans, women, and small farmers are the big groups I would stress.
Your work is all over our Cardinal News 250 project because it gets cited so often. The books you've written and the things you've kind of made a name for yourself over, which is this exact topic of people who we maybe didn't read about, or at least not in grade school, the formal schooling of most of us who are of a certain age. Let's talk about the very first book you wrote. Wasn't it Forced Founders? Is that the first one?
Right.
I'm saying that right? Okay.
Right.
What was that about? What made you want to go ahead and write a book? Like I mentioned, you are a professor of early American history. So you've been in the classroom and influenced countless students, I'm sure. But what was Forced Founders all about for you as a professional goal? Let's start with that.
It was really about marrying two sides of myself. I grew up in this political family. If you go to the Capitol in Richmond, on the third floor, they have portraits of all, I think the last 20 former governors. So Dad's still in there for the moment. And then at some point they head to the basement, but he's still up there on the third floor. And he chose that his portrait would be a copy of him holding a biography of Thomas Jefferson, the famous Dumas Malone 6-volume biography. And specifically, he chose the volume called Jefferson and the Rights of Man. So as I said, I've been interested in that from the start. But then I got to grad school right at Duke, right as historians were sort of rediscovering the 99% Native Americans, African Americans, women, small farmers, enlisted men in the wars. Before that, people had only written about the generals and the diplomats. But by the time I started at Duke in '82, and people were much more interested, frankly, in ordinary people. But I wanted to write about ordinary people and about politics, so I kind of hypothesized that maybe ordinary people affected politics more than we thought they did. And I think a great example of that was the one I gave before, these Native American women out on what's now the Illinois-Indiana border, starting, and then men also worked with them, this coalition of Native Americans to resist white encroachment on their land. So there's a group that you just don't think of when you think of the American Revolution, of Native American women, but they influence things. I think the biggest group that influenced things in Virginia that haven't really been recognized by everybody are African Americans. By the time of the Revolution, 40% of Virginians were enslaved. I'm talking to you from South Carolina, where a majority of the people were enslaved. But in all of those places south of the Mason-Dixon line, they were a significant part of the population. And then that became significant, maybe not so much in the early days in the battle over the Stamp Act, although they were involved in that. But in the later days, let's go to fall of 1774, the white colonists are mad at the British, but they don't want independence. They just want to go back to the way things were in 1762 before Parliament tried to tax stamps and tea and all that other stuff. So at 1774, the colonists mostly are kind of nostalgic for the good old days, but the governor, Lord Dunmore, he is trying to force them into these taxes and everything else, but he also knows that he's outnumbered. And you know who else knows he's outnumbered? Enslaved people, because they have an interest in knowing this, because they go, okay, it's really Governor Dunmore against the world among whites. He has very few loyalists in Virginia. He might need our help. And so it's actually James Madison, a young man at the time in 1774, reports that in a county near his, so somewhere in the areas between Fredericksburg and Charlottesville today, enslaved people got together and in October of 1774 and met to choose a leader to lead them when the English troops should arrive. So here we are. It's fall of 1774. The colonists do not want independence. They just want to turn back the clock to 1762. But here are African Americans already seeing kind of over the horizon. What's going to come next is a war. And there's lots of people ready to pick up a musket against the governor and hardly anybody ready to pick up a musket on his side. And so let's be ready and offer ourselves to him. And sure enough, the following year, 1775, we get the Battle of Lexington and Concord up in Massachusetts, and enslaved people do approach the governor. At first, he turns them away, and he kept turning them away, but they kept coming, and eventually he needed them so much. For instance, as river pilots and harbor pilots, that was a job that a lot of enslaved people had. We think of enslaved people picking tobacco. That's not till the 19th century in a place like Virginia. They are growing tobacco, but they're not just growing tobacco. They are carpenters, and women are running looms and spinning wheels, and men are also river pilots. So some of the people, initial people to join Governor Dunmore are river pilots, but more and more comes, so many that he starts referring to them as his Ethiopian regiment, because, Black Ethiopia, African Ethiopia is in the Bible, so everybody knew about that. It's mentioned in Homer as well. And so he's got an army now of a few whites, but mostly blacks. And from there, there's just two fascinating stories. One is all the African Americans who did fight on the British side during the war, and the British promised them their freedom. And the British government did something the British government rarely did in those days. It kept that promise. And the majority of those people died during the war, but the people who survived the war were resettled in Nova Scotia after the war. And I would urge people, if you're going on a nice cool place next summer, go to Nova Scotia and you can meet with some of these descendants of they're called Black Empire Loyalists, who got their freedom, ironically, by fighting against the people that we think of as apostles of freedom, people like Jefferson and Washington. So there's that story of what happened to these enslaved people who fought on the British side. We could also talk about up north, where you had black people fighting mostly on the American side and also getting free. But there's a third story here, and that is, imagine you're Thomas Jefferson and you've had 30 slaves escape to the British. That didn't happen until 1780, but he did have a bunch escape to the British. And others, they are furious at the British for forging what amounts to an alliance with enslaved people. So if you go to Jefferson's original rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, Congress changed it a lot, but in Jefferson's original version, the longest complaint, the most passionate complaint, the only one where he called the king a bad Christian, and those, of course, were fighting words then, as they are for many people still today, called the king a bad Christian. And it's the only one where he used all caps, and we all know, that's when you're really desperate and you don't know how to emphasize something, you just put it in all caps. Even Jefferson, that beautiful writer, resorted to all caps. All of this in one complaint, and that complaint was about the alliance that Governor Dunmore had made with enslaved people. And Jefferson and Congress blamed the British for this alliance. But if you followed my chronology just now, Dutchie, I showed you black people trying to join the governor, him turning down, they kept coming, and finally they sort of browbeat him into this alliance. So it's really black people who initiated that alliance. And why that's important is that we tend to think of slaves as politically inert. And so this long answer to a short question you asked, why did I write that book? I was testing out that theory. And some of my theories about people influencing the revolution didn't work out, but that's one that I think really did. So much that you could almost say, had there been no enslaved Virginians, there might not have been a revolution in Virginia.
We tend to think of history as, I guess, static, but did you hear back from anyone who disagreed with you in that book or another book about sort of what you were putting forth about, I guess, the significance of some things that just haven't been emphasized, at least not traditionally? It was many decades that I was in a grade school, but did you run into any resistance to those ideas?
Oh, I'm still running into resistance. When the 1619 Project came out, it was first a special issue of the New York Times Magazine in 2019 on the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first African Americans brought to Virginia as slaves. You have to stress Virginia because this is one of those firsts that we Virginians like to claim that we don't really deserve because, and this is one that we shouldn't be proud of anyway, because it was people being dragged here in chains. But, there were slaves in Florida in the 1500s. But that was Spanish territory. We used to not call it the Spanish any more than we counted African Americans and women. But anyway, this book came out, and I liked it a lot. It had flaws. So it became a book in 2021. I liked it a lot. It had flaws, but I thought it made great points. But it really touched a nerve with a lot of people who didn't want to tell this history. They wanted a more triumphalist history. And it's really raised the question of what do we want to be loyal to? Do we want to be loyal to the guys who fought the revolution and who wrote the documents, or do we want to be loyal to their principles? Because once you start worshiping human beings, you're going to run into trouble because we're all so imperfect, and they were imperfect just like us. But the principles are magnificent, and the principles are eternal. But yes, so people who thought that I was the 1619 Project and people like me writing about enslaved Americans in the Revolution, that it felt like we were tarnishing the enslaving founding fathers, people like Jefferson and Washington. So one thing I did was go on what was then called Twitter, and because they said, there's no proof of this, and I put up 76 documents, photographs of the documents, and then short paraphrases of them for people who didn't want to read 18th century handwriting. Of evidence of the anger. Like one guy, Archibald Carey, a friend of Jefferson's from Chesterfield County, Virginia, talked about how mad he was at the British for aiming a dagger at our throats through the hands of our slaves, stirring up our slaves against us. And actually, once I'd found that one reference to daggers, I found a dozen more, just using that one analogy. And so many people referring to the British because of this alliance with the slaves, using all the devil words, diabolical means devilish, and hellish, and so forth. They were really, really upset. And you had people like one of William Byrd's sons, William Byrd III's sons. He was going to fight on the British side, but he switched to fighting on the American side explicitly because the British had black people on their side, and he goes, anybody who's allying with them is no ally of mine. I own hundreds of black people, so he ended up fighting on the American side. It really moved people, and I think that's. I'm trying to make the best case I can. Well, here's the best case I can make for the other side, and it's certainly true. There were lots of other grievances as well. For instance, Lexington and Concord. I think 60 Americans were killed. I may be misremembering that day, and so that's the Boston Massacre times 14. That would make people mad. Times 13. Anyway, you get the idea. So the British made Americans mad by killing them at Lexington and Concord, and even if you're in Virginia, which is a few hundred miles away from Massachusetts, that would make you mad. And by the spring of 1776, we learned that the British were going to use these Hessian mercenaries, as we call them. They were actually from all over the various Germanies. Were going to be used as mercenaries. And so those things made people mad. And so I would, if I try to make the case against African Americans' influence, it's a fun question to take on. I could point to plenty of other grievances. But if you just read the letters and the newspaper statements and all the other things the colonists said, or if you read the Declaration of Independence, especially Jefferson's original rough draft, they were quite explicit that they were furious at this alliance with the slaves.
So as usual, more to the story than I guess what, as usual, as with all things, so much more to know and that you can learn from a situation, more than what we just kind of touch on in school, like at the basic level. If I'm not a historian or majoring in early American history at the University of South Carolina, the more you dig and the more you start really availing yourself of the documents and research, the more you find. I'm curious, Woody, we have seen how we teach American history become very political and controversial over the last several years. I am not asking you for 1 second to divulge any personal politics or beliefs you have. What I'm interested in from your point of view as a historian who has written and knows just a lot about these kinds of things, how would you, I guess, share more light on that subject versus heat? Like, what would you encourage people to think about or know in that ongoing conversation?
Number one thing I would encourage people to do is, and I say this as a dad more than as a professor, and that is trust your kids. Trust your kids with the truth, and in many cases with many truths, with many versions of the same story. Because I think, you mentioned I wrote a biography of Abigail Adams. I loved her on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, but that approximately half the time, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturdays, I hated her. She wouldn't let her. She prevented 3 of her kids from marrying the person they loved. And the worst of them was John Quincy Adams, who never ceased to remind his wife, Louisa Catherine Adams, the one I really liked was Rebecca Fraser. My point is, even such a revered figure as Abigail Adams, the woman who wrote Remember the Ladies, of course, her husband John ignored her. But somebody as revered as her, or revered as Jefferson, or revered as John Adams, he's lots to revere him about. We certainly don't have to revere him for saying, when Abigail wrote him, Remember the Ladies, he said back, I cannot but laugh at your idea. My point is that these people like you and me have multiple facets to them. And I think we should trust kids with the multiple facets. It does not diminish the principles to acknowledge, for instance, that Jefferson, who wrote All Men Are Created Equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that he owned slaves. It diminishes him a little bit. I have to admit that, but it doesn't diminish the principles, and it ought to be the principles that we care about, not about like these people. You hear about people doing genealogy. I don't know if this is true, but when they find a real scoundrel in their lineage, that piece of paper disappears. We're not here to make things disappear that are not perfect. The other thing I'd say to people, if you trust your kids with the whole story, the whole Jefferson, for instance, then it's so much more interesting. I mean, I was part of the resistance to Sally Hebig's story as a young guy, because I was at University of Virginia, and a lot of people were still teaching things the old ways there. But there was one historian there named Armistead Robinson who said, you ought to consider it's possible this Sally Hemings thing is true. And now, of course, since we all are such believers in science, most of us, this DNA evidence came out, and now almost everybody believes that. But my point is, the Jefferson story is much more interesting, knowing that he had this. He had a really racist attitude towards black people in general, but the person that he apparently thought he loved, maybe there's no such thing as true love between people who are so unequal, but he thought he loved this lady who was technically African American, although 3/4 white. My point is, the more complex version is always the more interesting version. I had a friend at Randolph Macon, what was then called Randolph Macon Women's College, who used to joke to me. I said, "How come you never assign my book?" And he goes, "It's too complex. My students only want to learn 2 sides." And he was kidding, but I think a lot of people have that notion that it's the complex version is just too much for our kids. They'll come out with a cynical view. But I would say the opposite of that. If you try to hide the warts, that just makes them makes them stand out more. So I say trust the kids with, and I'd also say give them alternative versions. I assigned the 1619 project in our I was teaching. We have a class for sophomore history majors, so they've just become history majors, and we're kind of acculturating them to what it's like to be a historian. And so I thought it would be fun for them to be involved in that debate. It's the first time I've ever gotten an email from a parent. 30 years of teaching, I got an email from a parent saying, "What are you doing assigning the 1619 project?" To that guy's credit, he completely calmed down when I told him. I sent him the syllabus and said, "Look, there's all these anti-1619 project essays that my students have to read as well." And that's what I think we should all be doing is assigning conflicting documents and trusting kids to reason with them. And I think they're just going to be much more excited if they are reading. Debates are so much more exciting than speeches. So I'm glad you asked me, though. Are there disagreements? I can't represent the other side very well, but I can represent that there is another side. And I think that just makes for a more interesting discussion than if we are saying, "Oh, Jefferson was perfect," or the opposite of that,
right.
Even more boring to say that he was nothing but a slaveholder.
Right, because it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And I recall school in learning about American history, the quote, founding fathers. There's almost a sacred place that we've put them. And sounds like what you're saying and what plenty of people say is, yeah, they were people just like everyone else who did some great things. But there's so many more people who framed the Constitution and who led us down this path. And I really appreciate that you like to tell those stories. And as I said before, self-promotion here, it fits perfectly with our mission at Cardinal News 250 of telling more stories, getting beyond just those basic highlights, basically, that we've all heard for many, many years.
And I've just sort of not discovered, because some historian, a literature professor at the University of Chicago helped me to a new point about this. If you got time, I want to tell you one more of those. So, as you know, the colonists, the Congress declared independence on July 2nd and adopted Jefferson's document. They struck out that whole big paragraph about enslaved people and replaced it with this very euphemistic phrase, "He has excited domestic insurrection amongst us," he being the King of England. And domestic insurrections, you may not have any idea what that means. Does that mean he's teaching my kids to rebel against me? Well, they do that on their own. They don't need that. No, it's referring to slaves, but it's, the word slave. Slaves were a crucial part of the American population. 1 in 5 Americans. The word slave is not used in either the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. And a lot of people take that as sort of a positive thing about the founders. At least they were ashamed of it. They didn't stop in that, most of them, having slaves, but at least they were ashamed of it. But here's my point. The Declaration comes out on July 4th, and then people start quoting it. Some people, newspapers print the whole thing, but individuals like George Washington and various legislatures, they only quoted pieces of it. And what would you guess they quoted? Probably you'd think they quoted "all men are created equal." Hardly anybody quoted that. What they quoted came from the end, which was the real business end of it. So what you would put in the lead as a journalist, free and independent states. We are now free and independent states. And actually, one reason it was easy for them to pick up on that as the main phrase is that the Congress used that phrase 3 times, twice in all caps at the end of the document. So free and independent states, that's what people quoted. And so it was not about individual freedom. It was about free states, that is, states' rights. It was a states' rights document initially, at least in the eyes of the people who wrote it. But there was one group of Americans that did quote "all men are created equal," and that is people fighting against slavery. Lemuel Haynes was a mixed-race soldier in the Continental Army. Benjamin Banneker helped design the street plan of Washington, D.C., also mixed race. And they wrote anti-slavery documents. And in Banneker's case, it was a direct letter an open letter to Jefferson, and he sort of threw that phrase back in Jefferson's face. Hey, you did write "all men are created equal. Let's see you implement it by helping abolish slavery." And then in the 19th century, you had not only anti-slavery people quoting "all men are created equal," but women's rights people quoted that phrase. And that sort of culminated, 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes that Declaration of Sentiments, and it goes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." Here's my point. By quoting that phrase and tweaking it like Elizabeth Cady Stanton did in a very positive direction, we all now say, I think, these anti-slavery people and pro-women's rights people drew attention to that phrase, all men are created equal, so that it's now the only phrase anybody can remember. If I put out a multiple choice question to my students, which of these quotes is in the Declaration of Independence? They'd all say created equal. Nobody probably even heard of free and independent states until I make them read the Declaration. And it's like in a theater, when the spotlight shifts from one actor to another, Black people and their white allies, women and their male allies, they shifted the spotlight of the Declaration from over here, in free and independent states, to over here, all men and women are created equal. And they changed the meaning of the document. And in a sense, they kind of rescued the document, because if it had only been about states' rights really got discredited in the Civil War. And it would have, as Lincoln said, it would have just been wadding on the field. But by changing the meaning of the Declaration to a created equal, it made it a much more valuable document. It's now a universal Declaration of Human Rights. But they also ensured, these anti-slavery people and pro-women's rights people ensured that the Declaration would last forever, and that Jefferson would be known not just as the third president, but he'd be known as an apostle of freedom. And so I think Jefferson gets a lot of his credit. The tremendous affection my father felt for him was not because, the Louisiana Purchase, that's good for some people, bad for other people, but the Declaration of Independence as a freedom document. And it was anti-slavery people and pro-women's rights people who made the Declaration of Independence a freedom document and made Jefferson an apostle of freedom. That's a reputation he would not have if it hadn't been for him writing those great words, but also for them drawing attention to those words.
That's so interesting. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that in a future podcast for Cardinal News 250, we are going to be speaking with some people from the Black Empire Heritage Center in Nova Scotia. So I'm really excited about that. Yeah, we've done some pieces on that in Cardinal News 250. Well, Mr. Holton, Woody, thank you so much for your time. This has been so interesting. Thanks for your work as well, in general. And we may speak again before the series is over, but thanks so much for spending time with us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I sure appreciate it, Dutchie.
Great. Woody Holton teaches early American history at the University of South Carolina, has written numerous books. His specialty is early American history. And we thank you for listening to Cardinal News 250. Please remember, so much of our work and previous articles, and you'll get more in the future, are available at cardinalnews.org. I'm Dutchie Jessee for Cardinal News.
Thanks for listening to Cardinal 250, made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. For more information on Cardinal News 250, including the Cardinal 250 and other newsletters, visit cardinalnews.org.